what I want to show you in this video is how to mix plaster and where some of the materials and tools are associated with that process in the ceramics workshop. So the first thing we'll need to do is get some plaster clay, which is stored in this cupboard here. Now this clay never gets fired, never goes in the kiln, and it's a little bit contaminated, so it's perfect for model making and moulding and things like that. You can prepare it in exactly the same way you would with other clays. So you can see here's a bit of contamination, bits of plaster, but it really doesn't matter, it's never going to get fired. And I'm working on this wooden board in the same way that I would with ordinary clay, and it's got clay board, no plaster, so we don't want to be casting on it. When you come to set your mould up, you need to be using one of these boards, the sort of white plastic coated boards, because it's much easier to clean up and remove plaster from these. So if we carry on rolling out some clay that we can use to set our mould up. That should be plenty. Now before I do that, I just want to show you how you could actually set up a mould with just boards and no clay at all, and particularly if you're trying to set something up where you're not quite sure of the size or the scale. If the boards are longer than you need, setting them up like this, just with the tail end sticking out, means you can set up any size you like. Now we're just going to use one board and a little piece of clay just for this demonstration, just so you can see how to join the clay without the plaster leaking. So that's done in the same way you might join bits of clay. You need some moisture, so a little bit of water pressed on the clay here, and then when you push that against the board, agitate the join, and that should be secure and hopefully not leak when you pour the plaster into the cavity. I think it's always a good idea to reinforce that, so you would use water, some moisture on there, and add extra clay that you know is going to make that board secure and the clay is secure all the way around. And this is especially true when the moulds get bigger. Right, we're going to need some water, so we're only doing a small mould, so we'll just use a pint for this, and a pint is equivalent to about half a litre, a little bit less. You can see that on there. Now please don't use jugs to mix your plaster in, as you can see this student has done, and completely destroyed the jug in the process, so that's no good to anyone. So we've got our pint of water, we now need the plaster. That's kept over here in this box, and you can see it's just a white powder. It's got a lid on it, so hopefully nothing spills in it. The digital scales, press the red button and they will then start to come on. Don't lean on them, and make sure the tray is on when you switch them on, otherwise you're going to get a misreading. Now we've got 1 pint of water, so we need 700 grams of plaster to make the ratio correct. It doesn't have to be exact or spot on, it could be a bit less or a bit over, but it's 700 grams. That would read on these scales as 0.70, because these scales measure in kilograms. So we've got our plaster and our water. We now just need a container to mix it in. These are perfect. Just recycle 5 litre tubs. They're ideal for mixing plaster in. Rule number 1, water first. and plaster second, not the other way around. If you do get it the wrong way around, it will just make a lumpy mix. And when you're adding your plaster, you can take your time over it, but it shouldn't take all day. Just be consistent and keep adding the material as you go. And you'll see as you start to finish adding the plaster, it may form an island, and you'll see the water saturating that island. What you mustn't do is put your hand in and mix it straight away, but what you can do is knock the top off the island. I don't need to here with such a small amount, but I'm just doing it to show it to you. And you'll see that powder is becoming saturated. Now it's perfectly fine for you to start mixing. And in the first 2-3 minutes, as long as the plaster isn't too old, it will remain quite runny. And you can see on my hands there, that's very runny. It's only slightly thicker than water, just because of the plaster that's been added. As you get into minute 3, 4, possibly 5, depending on the batch of plaster you've got, you'll need to be ready as it starts to get thicker and thicker. There's not an absolute rule as to when you should be pouring it. You have to judge that through experience, possibly make a few mistakes, and you'll soon realize whether it's better to pour it thinner or thicker depending on what you're doing. But you can see here, this is sort of medium to thick, and as I fill up the mold, it's got a slight peak to it, but if I shake the board, that evens out. So if there was any detail to that, it would pick it up still. Now with leftover plaster, you cannot put that down the sink or just pour it into the bin. It's going to cause big problems. So get a plastic bag or some paper, scoop out the excess onto that, and it can be dealt with once it's gone off and it's hard. It can be disposed of in the plaster bin. And even at this stage, it's interesting working with plaster, and you can do other things with it. Now you can wash out a small amount of plaster in the sink, that's perfectly safe. And in fact I would advise you do, because the tub is much easier to use next time. As you can see, that's a lot cleaner. If we go back to the plaster there, this is sort of minute 7. It's quite workable still, so it's getting used to the qualities of the material and how you could exploit that. 20 minutes later, it's now really hard and quite hot. So you know the reaction of it going off is happening. And the test to know whether you can release the clay or a board is if you get a clean line, and then you know that you can safely remove your mould. It can vary depending on the size of the mould or the shapes and things like that, but here we're quite safe to remove the clay. Always take the soft material away from the hard plaster, otherwise you might damage the model or the mould that you're making. That's quite a clean cast, and if you want to, some water, it'll remove the stain from the plaster clay if you want it to be just white. If it's got stuck to the board, tap it on the bench and that will release nicely off of there. Now there's a cupboard marked plaster tools, and in here the yellow coloured tools are surf forms or rasps, and they're ideal for removing excess plaster or sharp edges and tidying things up. And they're quite a good way of controlling as you're cutting. You could use a knife or a scraper and other things like that, but they're very good at taking large quantities of plaster off. If you need to dry your plaster, there is a cupboard that's heated and store things in here. Sometimes it can be as quick as overnight. Others that are bigger lumps of plaster, they may take a few days.